They told me you wish to hear about Ellen. I expect that is indeed what you want to hear. People who have been told that I had a daughter, I never apologize to, usually want to hear about that daughter, and I will not pretend otherwise or waste your time approaching the matter from the side. I am 92 years of age. I have very little patience left for the sideways approach to anything. I will tell you about Ellen. I will tell you what I did and why I chose to do it. And when I am finished, you may form whatever opinion of me you believe is warranted by the evidence. That has always been the arrangement between myself and other people, and I see no reason to change it at this particular hour. But first I will ask you to understand something about the year 1876, and about what it meant for a woman of 40 years to be standing in the yard of a Lancaster County farm on a June morning with a letter in her hand, informing her that her husband had died in the Lancaster General Infirmary at 6 o'clock the evening before, with his eldest son beside him and his wife not present because nobody had sent for her in time. I ask you to understand that Robert had been declining for 3 years by then, that the farm had been declining along with him, and that the weakening of both had happened at the same time as the raising of children, the running of a household, and the ordinary gathering of debt that attaches itself to a farm when the man who works it can no longer work it with his former strength. I ask you to keep all of that in your mind before you arrive at your judgments about what happened afterward. I was born on the 12th of March in 1836 in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, which is where I have lived for the whole of my life, and where I expect to end it before another year has passed. My father was Seamus Brannigan, Irish and Catholic, who came over in the 1820s with little beyond the particular stubbornness of his people, and a tolerance for hard labor that I have since come to regard as the most valuable inheritance a man can pass on to his children. He purchased 40 acres in 1829 before I was born, and by the time I arrived, he had cleared most of it and was beginning to show a modest profit from wheat and dairy. We were 6 children in our family, though only 3 of us reached adulthood. My sister Bridget died of typhoid when I was 4 years old, which I do not remember clearly, but which I recall in the manner of a very young child's distant awareness, an absence where something had once been. My mother's changed expression at certain moments. The small prayer book kept on the mantelpiece, that was the first thing she touched each morning, and the last thing before she retired at night. My brother James reached 25 years of age and died at Gettysburg in July of 1863. The youngest, a child born in 1844 who did not live through the night, was never given a name. My brother Patrick survived, and myself. My father did not speak about the children he lost. He was not a man formed for that type of expression. He rose at 4 in the morning and worked until dark, and went to church on Sunday, and voted according to his convictions, and raised his surviving children with a firm clarity of expectation that I absorbed so thoroughly that I can no longer locate where his expectations end and my own beliefs begin. This may be relevant to what I am going to tell you. I have considered it relevant on more than one occasion. I attended the common school from the age of 8 until I was perhaps 13. It ran 4 months of the year, from the end of harvest to the beginning of planting. I learned to read and to cipher and to keep a household account, which was the practical knowledge that a Lancaster County girl of that time required. I had a facility for arithmetic that I do not believe I inherited from anyone in particular, but it has served me throughout my life in ways that more fashionable accomplishments would not have. A woman who can add a column of figures without assistance is a woman who cannot easily be deceived about the state of her own affairs. This is a principle I acted upon throughout my life, and I commend it to any woman who might be listening. I married Robert Hatcher in April of 1855. I was 19 years of age, and he was 24. He had come to Lancaster County 2 years earlier from Chester County, where his family farmed, and had purchased 20 acres adjoining the Brenneman property on the Strasburg Road. He was a man of sound character and steady disposition, not given to excess of any kind, possessed of a humor that appeared rarely but well, and of a patience that I later concluded was the quality most necessary for a long acquaintance with me. We were not, in the romantic sense that certain poets celebrate, a love match born of high sentiment. We were two practical people who recognized in each other a compatible purposefulness, and we built accordingly. I do not say this to lessen what we had. I say it as a precise description of a thing that held together for 21 years under considerable strain, and that I would not trade for the more extravagant arrangements I have observed in others. Robert enlisted in August of 1862. He was 31 years old. He had a wife and 4 surviving children at that time. Thomas was 6, Ellen was 4, William was an infant, and Ruth had been born the previous spring. I took in the Hatcher farm alongside my own father's acres, which I was already managing as my father's health had begun its own decline. I managed both for 3 years with the assistance of Thomas when he was of any use, and the labor of 2 hands I hired on whatever terms I could negotiate, given that nearly every able-bodied man in the county was either at the front or demanding a premium for remaining behind. The war affected Lancaster County as it affected all counties in Pennsylvania, not in the destruction of property, as the fighting did not reach us here except briefly in '63, when Lee crossed the river, and the county was in considerable alarm, but in the removal of its men, the weight of its casualties, and the particular kind of grief that settles upon a community when the lists come back from Virginia or Tennessee and families read them in silence in the churchyard, and then walk home and continue their lives. My brother James is on one of those lists. He fell on the 2nd day at Gettysburg, not 3 miles from where I am sitting now. My father learned of it on the 5th of July 1863 and said nothing for the rest of the day, and went to work the following morning as usual. And if he and my mother spoke of it in their room that night, they did so beyond any hearing that I had access to. Robert came home in the spring of 1865, both legs intact, both arms, and no wounds of the body that I could see. But there was something in his lungs that had taken up residence in the camps of Virginia, a heaviness of breathing, a laboring that became noticeable in the 2nd year after his return, and worse in each year that followed. The physicians described it in different ways, and with the careful uncertainty that physicians often employ when they have no clear explanation to offer, a chronic catarrh. Another suggested the damp winters of the Shenandoah Valley. A third, who was newer to Lancaster County, and perhaps more candid than his profession generally encouraged, said that the camps produced a great many men who came home looking whole and yet were not whole, and that rest was the prescription, and that rest was unlikely to be obtained on a working farm with 4 children, and that he was sorry he could not offer anything more useful. He was correct on all counts. Robert worked the farm as long as he was able, which was until approximately 1874. From that year forward I managed it while he managed what he could from the house and the near yard. I want to be precise about what managing it meant, because there is a tendency in later accounts to simplify the labor of that kind of life into a general statement of hardship and leave it there, as though hardship were a condition one simply occupies, rather than a problem one solves every single day with particular decisions about particular things. I was purchasing seed on credit and negotiating with the bank at Strasbourg about the terms of the note against the property and hiring labor at wages I could barely afford, and maintaining the equipment and keeping the account books and keeping the account books and keeping the account books, attending to the children and to Robert and to the ordinary needs of the household, all at the same time, without any pause of length that I can now remember. During those years I was also watching Robert diminish in the slow and relentless manner of a man who has accepted his own weakening with the kind of resignation that can look very much like dignity until you have lived beside it long enough to see the difference. I have never entirely resolved whether what Robert possessed in those final years was one or the other. We had 3 more children after his return, George in 1869 and Claire in 1872, and between those two in 1866, an infant girl who lived 3 months before a fever of the lungs took her. By that point, we had come to a weary familiarity with infant loss. We buried her in the churchyard beside the boy we had lost in 1860, who had lived 12 days, and we continued. I want to speak now about Ellen because that is what you came to hear, and because everything I have told you so far is the ground upon which what happened with Ellen occurred. You cannot understand what I did without knowing that ground. Ellen was born in 1858, the second of our children. From early in her life she was the most singular of them. Not the most tractable. Thomas was tractable, and William and Ruth in their fashion. Ellen was not tractable. She had an opinion about most things, and the ability to express it clearly, which I recognized as a quality of value even when the opinion was directed at me, and the expression was inconvenient. She was a reader, as I was a reader, though her taste leaned toward things I found somewhat sentimental. She had a warmth of expression that Robert possessed, and that I did not. I do not believe I ever possessed it in the same measure. Neighbors considered her pleasant and agreeable. Children were naturally drawn toward her. She had, in the language of that period, a very pleasant face. I observed all of this with a certain quiet pride that I rarely expressed, as it was not my habit to speak openly about such feelings. There were moments during her girlhood that I have remembered with a clarity I do not normally give to sentimental matters. One occurred when she was perhaps 9 or 10 years old, during one of the more difficult winters of Robert's illness. I came downstairs very early in the morning, before the others had woken, and found Ellen already in the kitchen, with the fire prepared, and the coffee beginning to brew, and a lamp burning quietly on the table. She had risen, without being asked. She had looked at what the morning required, and she had already provided it. She looked up at me when I entered, and said, with the practical tone that was already part of her character, even at 9 years of age, that she had heard me moving during the night, and had thought I might want the fire started early. Then she returned to whatever she had been doing, and we did not speak further about it. That was the entire exchange. I have thought about it quite often in the 50 years since. She knew that I was pleased with her. The older Ellen, I believe she knew it in the quiet way. Children understand such things without needing them, spoken aloud. Perhaps I was mistaken in that belief. That is a matter about which I have never reached a final conclusion. In the summer of 1876, in the weeks after Robert's death, while I was occupied with calculating our real circumstances, the debts, the acres of land, the harvests expected against what we owed the bank at Strawberg, and what we owed Brennaman for the use of his equipment, during the years when our own had not been enough. Ellen was 18 years old, and keeping company with a man named Levi Morse. Levi Morse taught at the common school on the Picker Road. He had come to Lancaster County from somewhere in the northern part of the state, Lykeman County, I believe, or perhaps Clinton County, somewhere in that general area. He was around 25 years old, pleasant in appearance and manner, well-spoken, and possessed of no land, no livestock, no savings of any importance, and no realistic prospect of gaining any of these things on a schoolteacher's income. In practical terms, he had no material means. Before we continue, a quick word. I've released 14 full recordings that will never appear on YouTube. These are voices too personal and too raw to share publicly, completely unedited with nothing removed. If you want access, the link is in the description. It is called The Lost Recordings. Getting it helps us continue making these videos. All right, back to the story. I will say this for him. He was not foolish. He was not careless. He was a man of real education and sincere feeling, and I could see clearly, in a way that I found inconvenient, that Ellen was attached to him with a seriousness that went beyond the usual attachments of 19-year-old girls to pleasant young men. This was not a passing fancy. This was something she had reached with the same careful thought she brought to most things she undertook. In the spring of 1877, Ellen would have been 18 still, or perhaps just turned 19. I am certain she was 19. It was after March. I called her into the kitchen after supper and told her that Levi Morse had nothing to offer her and that the courtship must end. I told her this plainly, without explanation or apology. I had examined our circumstances with the same practical calculation I had applied to everything since Robert's health had begun to fail, and the conclusion was clear. I had a farm that required capable management. I had a son, Thomas, who was 21 and proving himself capable. I had debts that were manageable but not small, and I had a daughter of marriageable age, whose marriage represented, in the harsh arithmetic of our situation, a practical decision of some importance to the welfare of the remaining household. A daughter who married well eased certain burdens. A daughter who married a schoolteacher with no assets added nothing to the stability of the household, and removed from it one productive pair of hands. Ellen looked at me across the kitchen table for what I remember as a long time. She did not cry. She did not argue. She asked me with a precision of speech that reminded me strongly of her father whether I had made this decision without considering her wishes in the matter. I told her that I had considered the circumstances of our family, which I regarded as the relevant concern. She said nothing further that evening. She left the table and went upstairs, and I heard her walking in her room above me, where Guppy, and I remained seated for longer than I usually allowed myself to sit without work, and then I stood up and finished what still needed to be done and went to bed. There was a man named Cyrus Alderman who farmed 32 acres on Lampada Road. He was 33 years old in 1877. His wife had died in 75 from childbed fever, leaving him with a daughter of 3 years and a solid debt-free property. He was a steady man, not remarkable in character, not brilliant, not particularly warm, but dependable and financially secure, and equipped with the material circumstances that I had decided Ellen required. He had made known through the normal channels of the community that he was willing to be introduced to a suitable young woman. I arranged the introduction in the autumn of 1877, and I supported the courtship throughout that winter, and Ellen and Cyrus Alderman were married in March of 1878. Ellen was 20 years old. I will tell you what the wedding was like, because you may imagine something that did not match the reality. It was a respectable wedding. Cyrus had provided properly. The church was full. The supper afterward at the farm was well organized. Ellen wore the dress that had been prepared for her during the previous 2 months, a good gray wool dress with a cream collar that suited her well. She remained calm throughout the ceremony. She spoke her vows in a steady voice, without hesitation. During the supper, she spoke with each guest, attended to a new husband with the proper manners expected of her, and behaved throughout the evening as a young woman of good character and proper upbringing. She was correct in every detail. She did not look at me once with warmth, not once during that entire evening, and she never did again in the 43 years that remained in her life. I am not speaking of the coldness of open anger. Open anger I could have faced, and perhaps argued against, and I believe such an encounter might have served us better than what we had instead. What Ellen offered me from the morning of her wedding until the morning she died was something more complete than anger. It was the most perfect and sustained form of formal politeness I have ever encountered in another person. She was never rude to me. She never raised her voice. She answered every letter I sent with a reply of proper length and perfectly correct expressions of the expected sentiments. She attended every gathering where her presence was expected. Her brother Thomas's second marriage, the funeral of her sister Ruth's first child, the celebration marking my 75th birthday, which she organized and managed with the same capable efficiency that had always belonged to her. She arrived when expected. She left when it was appropriate. She addressed me as mother, without either warmth or bitterness in the word, in the manner of someone who says a word so many thousands of times over so many decades that the word loses its meaning and becomes only a sound. There was a Sunday in the summer of 1889. I can place it in the summer because of the heat and because of a particular hat Ruth's eldest daughter was wearing, which I remember as unsuitable for the occasion when we were all gathered at Thomas's farm for some celebration of his. There were perhaps 20 people present. I was sitting on the porch and Ellen was across the yard, near the barn, speaking with William's wife about something I could not hear. They had been talking for some time, and Ellen was gesturing slightly with one hand. She always gestured when she was engaged in a subject that interested her, a habit she had from Robert, and she laughed at something William's wife had said, a genuine open laugh that I had not heard directed toward me in 11 years. I watched her for perhaps a minute or perhaps too, while she remained unaware that I was watching. She was 31 years old. She was a capable and handsome woman in her full strength, and she was entirely relaxed in a way that she was never relaxed when near me. I do not say this to ask for sympathy. I mention it as a simple fact of the situation which I observed and carried home with me that afternoon. Without speaking of it to anyone, Levi Morse left Lancaster County in the spring of 1878, not long after the wedding. Where he went I made no effort to discover. I was told by my sister Catherine that he had obtained a teaching position somewhere in Ohio, Columbus perhaps, or one of the smaller towns in the western part of the state. I cannot confirm this. Whether he ever married, I do not know. He was a figure in my life for less than a year, and after that he disappeared from it completely, and I have spent very little of the following 50 years thinking about Levi Morse. Clara died of scarlet fever in the spring of 1880 at the age of 8. She was the youngest, and she was the one most inclined toward simple physical affection. She would take your hand without asking. She would lean against you without hesitation. George was 11 when she died, and he took it very hard. Thomas and William were already men by then, old enough to hide their feelings in the way men of that time and county were expected to hide such things. Ruth wept without restraint. Conscious awareness, which was Ruth's habit in nearly everything she did. Ellen, who traveled the 8 miles from the Alderman farm to stay with us during the sickness and the days that followed, moved through that week with the calm skill of a woman who knows what must be done, and does it without waiting for instructions. She took care of the younger children during the funeral. She arranged the meals that the neighbors brought. She sat next to me during the service in the place that a daughter would normally sit. She did not touch me. I noticed this. I noticed it very clearly, though. I did not allow the awareness to appear on my face, and I went on as usual. Cyrus Alderman proved over the long years of their marriage to be exactly the sort of man I had believed him to be. Steady, not especially exciting, entirely dependable, free from the habits that make a man difficult to live with, and lacking also the particular qualities that make a man a true companion, rather than simply part of the household. They had 4 children: Josephine in 1879, Albert in 1882, Herbert in 1885, and another daughter, who died in infancy in 1887. Of the 3 who reached adulthood, all are living as I speak to you now, in the summer of 1928. Albert farms the Alderman land. Josephine married a man from York County. Herbert manages a hardware business in Lancaster City. They are decent people, every one of them. Ellen raised them with the same careful ability she brought to every task she accepted. And Cyrus Alderman, who died in 1913 of a stroke a year after my own husband's decline by a different cause, left her a paid farm and a modest amount of savings, which was exactly what I had expected he would leave her, and which was what she required, or at least what I told myself then, and continue to tell myself now. My brother Patrick died in 192, and Catherine in 1917. She did not live long enough to see the end of that war, which took 2 of her grandsons. I suppose she was spared something by that, though Catherine possessed the kind of nature that finds a certain grace, even in survival. While I have always found that quality more difficult, I have never been the sort of person to find grace in simply enduring. When grace was available at all, I preferred to see it in something accomplished, rather than merely survived. I should mention something about the years around the turn of the century, because they were years when daily life changed in noticeable ways, and I was old enough by then to observe those changes with a perspective that younger people could not yet have. I was 64 years of age in 1900. Lancaster County in 1900 was in many ways a familiar version of Lancaster County in 1850 in its basic arrangements. Farms were still farms. Families were still families. The church remained the church. Yet the railroad had passed through the county for decades. By that time, the telephone reached the town in the 90s, and the speed with which the world now communicated with itself had changed in ways that the world had not completely understood or adjusted to. I watched my grandchildren grow up with an easy familiarity with fast communication, travel, and constant change. and I sometimes found it difficult to recognize that this was still the same basic world I had known in my youth. My granddaughter Alice, Ruth's second daughter, came to visit me in the summer of 1922 in an automobile belonging to her husband. They had driven from Philadelphia, which is about 70 miles away. The journey took them around 3 hours. I compared this in my mind to the memory of my father describing the same trip by wagon as a journey of 2 days that required planning and patience. Alice found my interest in this comparison amusing, as young people often find the calculations of old people amusing, and I did not mind that she laughed. What I was thinking about while she laughed was my father at the same age making a decision about a farm that would shape the next 40 years of his family's life, and the slow movement of information in that world, and the weight that such slowness placed upon every decision. When everything requires 2 days and costs money and cannot easily be undone without more time and expense, decisions carry a seriousness that they seem to have since lost. I am not completely certain that this change represents progress, though I understand that such uncertainty is exactly what one would expect from a woman of 92, and I do not insist upon it. The Great War took 2 of my grandsons. William's son Frederick returned from France in 1918 without his right hand, and he has since made himself entirely capable using his left. Thomas's youngest boy, Samuel, did not return at all. He was 20 years old. Thomas carried this loss in the same way his father had carried all losses, with a silence so complete that it said everything without a word. I sat with Thomas for an afternoon in the autumn of 1918. Yes, 1918. I sat with him that afternoon, and we did not speak about Samuel at all, and I believe this was correct. There are moments when speaking only enlarges the pain rather than reducing it. Thomas had always known better than most of my children which moments were those, and I trusted his judgment in that matter as I trusted him in many others. Ellen came when Samuel's death was confirmed. She came from the Alderman farm and stayed with Thomas and his wife for 2 days. By all reports that reached me, she was exactly what they needed during that time. She was 59 years old by then. Over the decades of her marriage and her management of her own home, she had grown into a woman of strong presence, not a warm presence in the ordinary sense of warmth. She did not brighten a room with easy affection the way Robert's people did. Instead, she filled a room with a steady gravity. People moved toward her during difficult moments because she herself did not move. There is a particular comfort in a person who remains steady when everything else shifts. She had that quality for me. I know this. I have known it for a very long time. It is one of those things that pass between us without discussion or decision. The inheritance that moves from a woman to her daughter, in the same way as certain bone structures, certain tolerances for cold, and certain ways of standing at a doorway. She had it from me, and she used it as I used it, in the work of managing what needed to be managed. It served her well, as it has served me, and I believe it served the people around her well too. Just as I believe in my calmer hours that it served the people around me. What it cost her in terms of what she did not possess is another matter entirely. I made one attempt to speak to Ellen directly about what had happened. This was in the winter of 1882, about 4 years after her marriage. I had gone to the Alderman farm for a practical reason, something about the boundary between our properties, or perhaps the use of a certain piece of equipment. I no longer remember the exact reason. Ellen met me in the kitchen. Cyrus was not in the house, and we were alone for a short time. In the weeks before that visit, I had been shaping in my mind the words I might say. I had prepared their general form and believed myself ready to speak them. Ellen offered me tea. She placed the cups and the pot on the table with her usual quiet efficiency. She asked about George and Ruth and William and their families by name. She told me about Josephine's progress at school and how Albert was improving in his understanding of the farm's drainage problem. She spoke for perhaps 15 minutes with the smooth ease of someone who had carefully prepared for a conversation that would move only in one direction. When she finished, she looked at me with the expression I'd come to know as her waiting expression, calm, polite, and entirely closed. In that moment, I understood that the words I had prepared would not be spoken that afternoon. I drank my tea. I finished my business concerning the boundary or the equipment or whatever reason had brought me there. Then I left. I did not try a second time. You may conclude from this that I lacked the courage to say what remained unsaid, and perhaps that judgment would not be entirely wrong. But I want to be exact with you, because I have been exact with you, because I have been exact with myself about this matter for nearly 50 years, and to be careless now would waste all that effort. What stopped me in Ellen's kitchen in 1882 was not exactly fear. It was the realization that what I could offer in explanation, even after careful preparation, would not have been enough. Not for Ellen. I knew my daughter. Whatever sorrowful words I might have produced would not have reached the measure required. And I have never been a woman who undertakes tasks for which she knows she is unequal. I examined the situation, and I withdrew, whether Ellen wanted me to try anyway, regardless of success, whether the attempt itself might have held some value for her, even if the result failed. That is the question I have returned to most often in the years since her death. I have not answered it in a way that satisfies me. I am 92 years old, and I doubt I will answer it before the matter ends, in the only way such matters end. She died on the 4th of February 1921. Josephine wrote to tell me. Pneumonia, she said, though Ellen had never been a woman who surrendered easily to ordinary illness. I believe the pneumonia was helped by a body that had been carrying its burdens for a long time. She was 63 years old. Her father died at 45. I am 92, and still sitting in this room answering questions. There is something in that arithmetic that seems meaningful, though I cannot say exactly what the meaning is. I went to the funeral. I sat in the front of the church. Josephine and Albert and Herbert sat beside me, and they were kind to me. People spoke to me in the careful way that people show kindness to an elderly woman at a funeral when they are also grieving themselves and do not wish their attention to be divided. I looked at Ellen lying in the coffin, and she had the same expression she always wore when she was handling something with full attention and did not want to be disturbed. I have thought about this many times since then. Perhaps I am projecting. I am 92 years old, and I believe I have earned the right to project a little. After the service, Albert took me aside in the church hall. He is a thoughtful and deliberate man. Albert is. In certain ways, he reminds me of his grandfather, Robert. He has the same habit of careful speech and the same patience with the pause between thinking and speaking. He told me that his mother had asked in her final days, when she understood she was dying, whether Margaret had ever said anything to Josephine or Herbert, or to him about the circumstances of her marriage. He said she asked it without any visible emotion, simply as a question, as though she were asking about an account that needed checking. Albert told me he said no, and that she nodded and seemed satisfied with the answer. He said he was not sure what she expected him to understand from the question. I told Albert that I was not certain either. That answer was true, though it was not the full truth. The full truth is that I have spent the 7 years since Ellen died turning that question over in my mind. The question she sent out into the world during the last days of her life, knowing it would eventually reach me, choosing to send it as a question instead of an accusation. Ellen was always a precise woman. She have known the difference. A question asks for something. An accusation only declares something. She asked the question, which means she did not know, which means that I kept my silence so completely for so many years that she never knew whether I had ever understood the cost of what I did. She never knew whether I realized what I had done to her, whether any part of me had paid attention to the woman she became in the life I arranged for her, and understood what that life contained and what it lacked. She died without knowing. I find this the most difficult fact of the entire matter. Not the 43 years, and not my own decision, which I have examined from every angle available to me, and still cannot change. The hardest truth is that she died not knowing whether I had ever truly seen her. And I had. I had seen her completely. I had seen her when she was 9 years old, rising early at 5 in the morning to lay a fire because she heard me moving in the night and thought I might want warmth sooner than usual. And I saw her in every year, that followed with the same clear understanding and the same quiet recognition that I never spoke aloud. She did not know it, and now she is gone, and the knowledge serves neither of us. I did not apologize to Ellen. I want to make that point perfectly clear, because I know that a story such as this usually leads listeners to expect a final moment, where the person speaking arrives at some clear expression of remorse. I am not going to satisfy that expectation, and I want to explain plainly why. I made a decision in 1877 based on the real situation of my family at that particular moment. I had a farm that needed a capable future. I had debts that had to be managed. I had a daughter of marriageable age, whose marriage, if arranged well, would strengthen the security of the household. I looked carefully at Levi Morse and found that he lacked the qualities our circumstances required, so I arranged what I believed was a better alternative. That is what I did, and that is why I did it. The facts of the matter have not changed with the passing years, because facts do not change. Cyrus Alderman did leave Ellen a farm that was fully paid for. Ellen's children did grow up with stability and enough means. Those things happened. What also happened is that I forced a woman of 19 years to leave the man she had chosen and marry someone she did not choose, and to live with the result of that decision for 43 years. She died without knowing whether I had ever truly considered what that had cost her. That also happened. There is a principle I learned in my father's house, not through his words, but through the example of how he lived. He believed that an honest accounting of events is owed to anyone who asks for it, no matter whether that accounting reflects well on the person giving it. He was a man who spoke about his own mistakes with the same accuracy that he used when speaking about everything else. I have tried to live by that example throughout my life, and I am trying to follow it now. I made a decision in 1877. That decision gave Ellen material safety and took away the life she would have chosen for herself. I will not pretend otherwise. I will also not apologize for it. These two positions can exist together. I have held them side by side for 50 years, and I see no contradiction between them. I did think about what it cost her. I have thought about it many times over the last 50 years. I never told her that, and she died without knowing it. I will spend whatever time remains to me carrying this particular unfinished matter with me. It is not something I accept with calm ease, but it is the result of choices that, given the same circumstances and the same knowledge, I believe I would make again. A person who claims to have no regrets is usually either unusually fortunate or not honest about their own past. I am not a person without regret. I am simply a person without apology. These are different conditions, and I want that difference to be clearly understood. I have been told that people who listen to these recordings sometimes comment on the way people spoke who were born in the century before theirs. They say we spoke more slowly and more carefully, with a kind of formality that may sound stiff to modern ears. That may be true. It was the way I was taught to speak, and it is the way I have always spoken. I find it sufficient for the purposes speech is meant to serve. Throughout my life I said what I meant to say, and people understood me. If there were things I did not say that perhaps I should have said, the failure was not a lack of words, but a lack of willingness. The house Robert and I built in 1859 is still standing today. Thomas's family lives there now. The barn was expanded in 1912. Robert would certainly have had strong opinions about the way it was done, and I also had my own opinions about it. Both sets of opinions were ignored, which is the natural fate of the opinions held by the dead and by the very old. The farm now covers 80 acres, which is more land than my father ever had, and more than Robert had, and exactly as much as I once hoped for. The wheat did reasonably well this past season, or so I have been told. I am no longer asked about the daily running of the farm, which is also appropriate. Since I have not walked the far fields in perhaps 4 years, I will tell you one final thing, and then I am finished. On the evening after Ellen's funeral, after I returned home, and the household grew quiet, and everyone who had come to look after me had been thanked and sent away, I sat alone in the kitchen for some time. Being alone is something I have always found easier than most people seem to find it themselves. I sat there for perhaps an hour, which is longer than I usually allow myself to sit, without a task or purpose. And I thought about Ellen when she was 20 years old, wearing a grey wool dress with a cream collar, standing in the church on the Strasbourg road, and speaking her vows to a man she had not chosen. Her voice was clear and steady without even the smallest tremor. She was my daughter, and she would not give me or anyone else in that room the satisfaction of seeing her voice shake. And I remember thinking that she was right not to. She was entirely right. I knew it then, and I know it now. Whatever else I forced her to do, I could not force that from her. She knew it, and she held it back. And I was proud of her for that strength, with a pride I never spoke aloud, and she never knew I felt. That is everything I have to say about it. I am finished.